Good evening.
I don't know if you're quite there yet. Are we there? Hello! Don't say hello world, that's a whole other thing. Here we go. We are there. Yay. Hi everybody.
Welcome to Henry Lawson number 2.
Saturday streaming number 11, I think. Number 11. And yeah, Henry Lawson part 2. We're not rushing our way with Henry. Some people joining in already? Yes. Hello. Hello. Wow, a couple of people from further afield. So you need to know where we are. We're in Millthorpe, in the tablelands of New South Wales. So straight behind you over there, about 250 kilometres, is Sydney. Hi, Sydney. Actually, between us and Sydney is a nice big painting of John Dengate, which is who we're singing for as well as you all. And that's north up there, okay, and south and east. And we're in the tablelands, so we're in Henry Lawson country. Henry was born about 2 hours in that direction, and he spent the first, until he was 15, 16, just about 2 hours drive in that direction. So he was a tablelands kid, like me. Yeah, well, I mean, it's Wiradjuri country. It's been Wiradjuri country for an awful long time, and it still is, and it always will be. I'll say that before we start. Henry Lawson, yeah, we left him in Burke.
We did.
There's worse places to be stranded for a couple of weeks than Burke. And you might remember, I'll remind you just in case you don't, that it was in 1892-3 when Archibald got together. It was actually Brady, his drinking mate Brady's idea. Brady got together with Archibald at the Bulletin, and they sent Henry off on the train. A £5 note and a one-way train ticket to Burke. The train line had just been pushed through too, if you think about it. It had only just gone through.
Oh, there was a big competition between the rail and the shipping, wasn't there?
Of course, yeah.
The big wheelboats.
Yeah. So Henry was out there, and you know, Henry had already had that competition with Banjo and the Bulletin, with you know, earning themselves a few extra dollars, having this sort of a boxing match between them both over Henry's sort of fairly bleak view, so-called, of the bush. I would just call it honest, and Banjo's romanticised view of the bush, which I would just call honest too. And they had a lot of fun with that. But I know when after that train trek through from Bathurst up to Burke, in Henry's first letter back to his auntie, he wrote, "I was right, Banjo was wrong." It might have been a dry year. But anyway, here's to you, Henry. Here's to you, Henry. It's nice to be back in Burke with you all. And we're going to pretty much stay there tonight, I've got to say. Chloe and I both think
it's a hard place to leave.
It's a hard place to leave. No Burke and no Australia, as Henry said.
No, Henry was inspired by his time in Burke for a very long time afterwards. Lots of his writing.
Archibald had two motives, really, and the big one, the main one Archibald at the Bulletin had was sending Henry off, as he put it, in search of copy. You know, to get him something to write about. He was becoming a bit of a creature of the rocks, and the last thing the Bulletin wanted was a poet of the rocks. They wanted a poet of the bush. So get Henry back off to Burke, into his home. I mean, Henry was a bush, make no mistake, Henry was a bush person. But yeah, get him off in search of copy, and it worked really well. He wrote about it for the rest of his life with varying degrees of bitterness and romanticism and more and more sort of honesty, I think, as the years went by. And we did a little bit of that last week. We've already done the Green Hand Rouseabout about him working out at Turondale. When he first went to Burke, of course he did. He had great fun hanging out with all the union leaders in town. This was the time of the great shearers' strikes. He was hanging out with and great mates, you know, philosophically, right as one, solidarity forever with those union lads in town, drinking and sorting out the problems of the world, writing for the Western Herald from the union's perspective as Joe Swallow or Tally, writing poems pushing the union perspective. There's some fairly good evidence that he was also writing the argument from the other paper at the same time. We wouldn't put it past Henry. He's a canny man.
It worked once, it could work again.
Yes, and he could make the right winger look like a terrible poet. But then when he went out and actually started working at Turondale Woolshed in summer, in a fully metal, Australia's first fully metal shearing
What a great idea.
Yeah. He started to have a little well, some reality started to intrude on his politics a little bit, but anyway, we'll get to that. The other reason, by the way, that Archibald had for sending Henry off on that train with that one-way train ticket and the £5 note was to get him off the grog. Something that was tried often in Henry's life, but in this particular case, they chose to send him to Burke. Now, I would have thought that would make Henry just about the only man in history to have been sent to Burke to get off beer. So cheers, everybody, and we'll pick up Henry's story now with one of his better-known poems from Burke. Chloe's going to play a concertina here that's about as old as Henry, actually.
Just about.
Yeah, 1872 for this one, I think, and Henry was born in 1867. Yeah, and some tunes, two from Mudgee. Yeah, good choice, Chloe.
I'm sure you had a bit to do with it too. All right, here we go.
It was somewhere in September, and the sun was going down, when I came in search of copy to a darling river town. Come and have a drink, we'll call it. 'Tis a fitting name, I think. And it was raining, for a wonder, up at Come and have a drink. 'Neath the public house veranda, I was resting on a bunk, when a stranger rose before me, and he said that he was drunk. He apologised for speaking. There was no offence, he swore, but he somehow seemed to fancy that he'd seen my face before. No offence, he said. I told him he needn't mention it, for I might have met him somewhere. I'd travelled round a bit, and I knew a lot of fellas in the bush and in the streets, but a fella can't remember all the fellas that he meets. Very old and thin and dirty were the garments that he wore, just a shirt and a pair of trousers and a boot, and nothing more. He was wringing wet and really in a sad and sinful plight, and his hat was in his left hand and a bottle in his right. His brow was broad and roomy, but the lines were somewhat harsh, and a sensual mouth was hidden by a drooping fair moustache. And his hairy chest was open to what poets call the wind, and I would have bet 1,000 these pants were gone behind. He agreed. You can't remember all the chaps you chanced to meet, and he said his name was Sweeney. People lived in Sussex Street. He was camping in a stable, but he swore that he was right, only for the blanky horses walking over him all night. He'd apparently been fighting, for his face was black and blue, and it looked as though the horses had been treading on him too. But an honest, genial twinkle in the eye that wasn't hurt seemed to hint of something better, in spite of drink and rags and dirt. It appeared that he mistook me for a long-lost mate of his, one of whom I was the image, both in figure and in phiz. Who'd have had a letter from him if the chap were living still, for they'd carried swags together from the Gulf to Broken Hill. Sweeney yarned a while, and he hinted that his folks were doing well. He told me that his father kept the Southern Cross Hotel, and I wondered if his absence was regarded as a loss when he left the elder Sweeney, landlord of the Southern Cross. He was born in Parramatta, and he said with humour grim that he'd like to see the city. The liquor finished him, but he couldn't raise the money. He was damned if he could think what the government was doing. Here he offered me a drink. I declined. 'Twas self-denial. And I lectured him on booze, using all the hackneyed arguments that preachers mostly use. Things I'd heard in temperance lectures. I was young, rather green. I ended by referring to the man he might have been. Then a wise expression struggled with the bruises on his face. Though his argument had scarcely any bearing on the case. What's the good of keeping sober? Fellas rise and fellas fall. What I might have been and wasn't doesn't trouble me at all. But he couldn't stay to argue, for his beer was nearly gone. He was glad, he said, to meet me, and he'd see me later on. He guessed he'd have to go and get his bottle filled again, and he gave a lurch and vanished in the darkness and the rain. And of afternoons in cities, when the rain is on the land, visions come to me of Sweeney with his bottle in his hand, and the stormy night behind him, and the pub veranda post. And I wonder why he haunts me more than any other ghost. Still, I see the shearers drinking at the townships in the scrub, and the army praying nightly at the door of every pub, and the girls who flirt and giggle with the bushmen from the west. But the memory of Sweeney overshadows all the rest. Well, perhaps it isn't funny. There were links between us two. He had memories of the cities, he'd been a jackaroo, and perhaps his face forewarned me of a face that I might see from a bitter cup reflected in the wretched days to be. I suppose he's tramping somewhere where the bushmen carry swags, cadging round the wretched stations with his empty tucker bags. And I fancy that of evenings, when the track is growing dim, what he might have been and wasn't comes along and troubles him. Here's to you, Henry. Nice to see everybody. I'll look at the comments now. I'm terrible at doing it, but I'll try. Yeah. Hi, Pam. Hi, Kathy. Hi, Tony. Peter Mace, Macy. How you going? Hi, Marg. Hi, Shane. Nice to see you again. We're going to keep Henry out in Burke now. Like I say, his first response to being in Burke was to hang out with the union bosses and write for the Western Herald and yeah, hurrah for the unions. But yes, his experience at Turondale Woolshed as a sensitive man, someone who most people who met would describe as either effeminate or quite sensitive, an older man, certainly someone who didn't see a career as being a rouseabout. He hit some of the realities of the bush, and his politics started to have some different edges put on them. And then he tramped famously to Hungerford and back in summer. He went back to Burke for Christmas, had Christmas with his union mates. Famous descriptions of he'd talk about them sitting in their underwear on the veranda, throwing buckets of water on just to try and kind of keep the place cool. Henry hated the idea of a roast dinner for Christmas. Hated. That's old country stuff. It's almost un-Australian, I think Henry thought. But then, yes, they walked off to Hungerford, tramped to Hungerford and back. And it's not only the people that were working in the sheds that he started to be affected by. He got a very significant experience of the country.
Mm-hmm. I'll read to you a little extract from an essay by John Barnes that was published a couple of years ago. And he talks about, Henry was criticised for basically not romanticising the bush, for being too hard, too straight, But no reader of Lawson's work can doubt that he was deeply affected by his experience of going up the country. And after his return to Sydney, he mocked popular Australian mistakes about the bush. And he concluded with a declaration that sums up the impact of the Burke experience. We wish to heaven that Australian writers would leave off trying to make a paradise out of the outback hell, if only out of consideration for the poor, hopeless, half-starved wretches who carry swags through it and look in vain for work, and ask in vain for tucker very often. Now what's the good of making a heaven of a hell when by describing it as it really is, we might do some good for the lost souls there?
Game, set and match, Henry.
Yep.
Yeah. That's what he saw his job as a writer his whole life was to help, always to help. Famously, when he was carrying his swag with his mates, he was the first person to help always in camp. This is another piece from 1893. This is Outback. Campbell the Swaggy recites this very, very well, so we wrote a tune so we didn't get onto his territory. I see a couple of people joining in from south of the border too. G'day, hello down there in Melbourne. It's nice to have your company. I hope things are on the improve down there. I've already situated for people out there. We're here in Millthorpe in the Tablelands, so we're in what they call the soft country here. And this poem, Outback, this is not the soft country. This is the hard stuff.
The old year went and the new returned in withering weeks of drought. And the cheque was spent that the shearer earned, and the sheds were all cut out. The publican's words were short and few, and the publican's looks were black. For time had come, as the shearer knew, to carry his swag out back. For time means tucker, and it's tramp you must, where the scrubs and plains are wide. With seldom a track that a man can trust, or a mountain peak to guide. And all day long, in the dust and heat, those men of the outside track, with stinted stomachs and blistered feet, they carry their swags out back. Trapped away from the shanty there when the days were long and hot, with never a soul to know or care if he died on the track or not. The poor of the city have friends in woe, no matter how much they lack, but only God and the swag will know how a poor man fares out back. He begged his way on the parched Paru and the Warrego trucks once more, and he lived like a dog, as the swagmen do, till the western station was shore. The men were many and sheds were full, for work in the town was slack, and the traveller never got hands in wool, though he tramped for a year out back. In stifling noons, when his back was run by its load and the air seemed dead, and the water warmed in the bag that hung from his aching arm like lead, or in times of flood, when plains were seas and the scrubs were cold and black, he ploughed in mud to his trembling knees, and he paid for his sins out back. Oh, and dirty and careless and old he wore, as his lamp of hope grew dim. He tramped for years till the swag he bore seemed part of himself to him. As a bullock drags in the sandy ruts, he followed the dreary track, never a thought but to reach the hearts when the sun went down out back. Now it chanced one day when the north wind blew in his face like a furnace breath, he left the track for a tank he knew it was a shortcut to death. Oh, for the bed of the tank, it was hard and dry and crossed with many a crack. And oh, it's a terrible thing to die of thirst in the scrub out there. Drover came, but the reach of law was eastward many a mile, and he never reported the thing he saw, for it was not worth his while. Now the tanks are full, the grass is high, in the mulga of the track, where the bleaching bones of a white man lie, by his mouldering swag out back. Trap they must, where the scrubs are playing wide. I would seldom a track that a man can trust, or a mountain peak to guide. And all day long Outback all day long. All day long. Those men are the outside track.
Outback from 1893 as well, another piece from Henry's time. Not so much in Burke, but beyond Burke, you know, over the North Burke Bridge and away. And as they say, if you cross the North Burke Bridge, you'll always come back. Another piece from 1893 now. In Sweeney, Henry just briefly mentions the army, the salvos, praying at the door of every pub. And yes, you've got plenty of pubs in Burke to choose from and surrounds. And this is a piece he wrote about the Carrier's Arms. He disguised the Carrier's Arms in a few of his poems as all kinds of things. He calls it the Shearer's Arms, and Henry's work was always based on his life, but never exactly. And the publican there, Watty Braithwaite, Watty, had an interesting relationship with the salvos. The army, Henry reckoned the army prayed there louder and more often than any other pub in town, and with pretty good reason, by the reputation of the hotel and the reputation of the drinkers.
It was where they could do the most good, I think, was the idea.
That was the idea, yes. Where they could make the most money. Henry reckoned they had a lovely, pretty girl that everyone in town was keen on, and she was part of the salvos, and I think Henry considered that they were shamelessly using her as fundraising.
Hold the collection basket.
Yes. Yeah. But I don't really think that the salvos were getting rich out there. But I do like this poem of Henry's. By the by, Watty, the publican in this particular piece, did end up running for Parliament, and he was a bit of an interesting reputation as a politician. This was definitely a union pub. This was a working man's pub, and what his politics were on that side. He ended up owning a pub on the corner of Goulburn Street and George Street in the middle of Sydney. He ended up moving on from Burke and down. Well, what a change. And the funny thing is, I think it's still a pub. I think there's an Irish pub on the corner there now. When I first went to Sydney in the mid-80s to play, or late mid-80s, to play some gigs, I did a couple of gigs there in a pub then, so it would have only been 50 so years later or something. So,
nothing.
Yeah, nothing. Yeah. So, when the army prays for Watty. When the kindly hours of darkness, save for light of moon and star, hide the picture on the signboard of a Doherty's horse bazaar. When the last rose tint is fading on the distant mulga scrub, then the army prays for Watty at the entrance of his pub. Now I often sit at Watty's when the night is very near, with a head that's full of jingles and the fumes of bottled beer. For I always have a fancy that if I am over there when the army prays for Watty, well, I'm included in the prayer. Oh, Watty lounges in his armchair in its old accustomed place, with a fatherly expression on his round and passive face. And his arms are clasped before him in a calm, contented way, and he nods his head and dozes as he hears the army pray. Does he ponder on the distant years and dim, or his chances over yonder as the army prays for him? Has he not a fear connected with that warm place down below, where, according to good Christians, all the publicans should go? but his features give no token of a feeling in his breast, save a peace that is unbroken and a conscience well at rest. And we guzzled as we guzzled long before the army came, and the loafers wait for shouters and they get there just the same. Oh, it would take a lot of praying, lots of thumping on the drum, to prepare our sinful straying erring souls to kingdom come. But I love my fellow sinners, and I hope upon the whole that the army gets a hearing when it prays for Watty's soul. I know Chloe's dad loved that poem too. It's one of my favourites as well. I won't put my guitar down just now. I thought, oh yeah, we're going to do this one.
Not yet.
One of the things Henry was known for, I mentioned earlier that a lot of people who met him thought that he was, well, some people use the word effeminate, certainly sensitive. In 1888, his father died, Niels Lawson died, and he met Mary Carin, soon to be Mary Gilmore, down the track. So at this point in his life, he's lost his dad, who he'd just started working with up in the Blue Mountains, the Mountains Push, and had sort of fallen in with starting to understand exactly how beer makes you feel the way you ought to feel without beer. So he was drinking a lot, and his dad was worried about him. And his two biggest influences that I can see at that point in his life on his writing are Mary Gilmore and Louisa Lawson, two mighty writers and two women.
And many of you would have read, I'm sure, The Drover's Wife and other stories of his where he demonstrates the female perspective of the bush and isolation, the effect of isolation. When the children come home, there's another one. Yeah.
Did you just mention The Drover's Wife?
I did.
Yeah, I listened to it last night and it made me cry again. That's Lawson doing something that I've never read or heard anyone else do. I don't know what you call that kind of writing, but it is extraordinary. Those sketches that he could make.
This has been set beautifully to music by Phil Lobel, and it was one of the first Henrys we would have played, probably. That's right.
Henry Lawson was the first poet that Chloe and I ever set to music. You know, someone else's words, and we wrote the music, but it wasn't. And it was also the first time it was on our second album, and we rang Phil up and asked if she minded if we'd record this song. And I'm really pleased she said yes. We didn't know Phil then, but she said yes, and so we did.
Gosh, these days Phil is developing an entire website that's got the resources to teach kids music, and it's a major work. It's extraordinary. So have a bit of a sticky beak. Now up and down the siding ground, the great black crows are flying. Down below the spur I know another milker's dying. The crops have withered from the ground, the tank's clay bed is glaring. From my heart no tear nor sound, for I have got past Carin. Through death and trouble, turn about, through hopeless desolation, through flood and fever, fire and drought, through slavery and starvation, through childbirth, sickness, hurt and blight, through nervousness and scaring, through being left alone at night, I've come to be past caring, past bothering or caring, past weeping or despairing, through being left alone at night, I've come to be past caring. Our first child took in days like these, a cruel week in dying, all day upon her father's knees, and on my poor breast lying. The tears we shed, the prayers we said, were awful, wild, despairing. I've pulled 3 through and buried 2 since then, and I'm past caring, past bothering or caring, past weeping or despairing. I pulled 3 through and buried 2 since then, and I'm past caring. 'Twas 10 years first, then came the worst, all for a barren clearing. I thought at first my heart would burst when first my man went shearing. He's droving in the great northwest, I don't know how he's faring. One that loved him best have grown to be past caring, past bothering or caring, past weeping or despairing. I, the one that loved him best, have grown to be past caring. My eyes are dry, I cannot cry, I've got no heart for breaking. And there it was in days gone by, a dull and empty aching. My last boy ran away from me, I know my temper's wearing. I only wish to be beyond all signs of caring, past bothering or caring, past weeping or despairing. Now I only wish to be beyond all signs of caring.
Louisa herself would have, I think, at times have had as many as 4 kids at home, all very young, with Niels away. So Henry had seen that firsthand growing up, all around him, including in his own home. This is a story that I've loved since I was a kid, and we've got Henry, on that trek to Hungerford now, in his own imagination as well as in reality, and I guess it's just a contrast with that last piece. The blokes are away on the track. Probably Jim Gordon and Henry together, trekking to Hungerford. There are so many probablys and maybes. The great thing about Henry is that he's a legend, and no matter what we say tonight, there's 1,000 people out there ready to say, that's not how I heard it. And that's what's so good about it. That's exactly what we love. All right, also remember doing this when we first did the show with Chris Kempster. We always like to thank Chris when we do these shows to do with Henry Lawson, especially with songs and poems, because Chris, well, put the book together, as well as writing such great tunes that he's of his own, which we'll get to sing a little bit later on. Yeah, but this story, Hungerford from 1896, so he put it together after he got home, when probably just enough time had passed so he could have a laugh at himself and the town of Hungerford. Nice to see you're joining in. Oh, your Baron got a nice tick of approval from Chico there.
Oh, thank you, Chico. That's a relief. Wasn't sure how that would carry. All right.
Chloe's going to play a couple of tunes. All tunes from this area. That's what we're doing, is trying to put Henry, when we're using traditional tunes, sometimes we're writing music, sometimes we're using other people's settings. Also, you're liking to use the tunes of this area, the tunes that Henry would have heard growing up.
Cosgrove, Schottische, Bob and the Wash House, and a couple of tunes from Joe Yates as well.
Hungerford. One of the hungriest cleared roads in New South Wales runs to within a couple of miles of Hungerford and stops there. Then you strike through the scrub to the town. There's no distant prospect of Hungerford. You don't see the town till you are quite close to it, and then 2 or 3 whitewashed galvanised iron roofs start out of the mulga. They say that a past ministry commenced to clear the road from Burke under the impression that Hungerford was an important place, and went on with the blindness peculiar to governments till they got to within 2 miles of the town. Then they run short of rum and rations and sent a man on to get them and make inquiries. The member never came back, and 2 more were sent to find him or Hungerford. 3 days later, the 2 returned in an exhausted condition and submitted a motion of want of confidence, which was lost. Then the whole house went on and was lost also. Strange to relate, that government was never missed. However, we found Hungerford and camped there for a day. The town is right on the Queensland border, and an inter-provincial rabbit-proof fence, with rabbits on both sides of it, runs across the main street. This fence is a standing joke with Australian rabbits. It's about the only joke they have out there, except the memory of Pasteur and poison and inoculation. It's amusing to go a little way out of town about sunset and watch them crack Noah's Ark jokes about that fence, burrow under, play leapfrog over until they get tired. One old buck rabbit sat up and nearly laughed his ears off at a joke of his own about that fence. He laughed so much he could hardly get away when I reached for him, and I could hardly eat him for laughing. I never saw a rabbit laugh before, but I've seen a possum do it. Hungerford consists of 2 houses and a humpy in New South Wales and 5 houses in Queensland. Characteristically enough, both pubs are in Queensland. We got a glass of sour yeast at one and paid 6pence for it. We had asked for English ale. The post office is in New South Wales and the police barracks in Bananaland. The police cannot do anything if there's a row going on across the street in New South Wales except to send to Brisbane to have an extradition warrant applied for, and they don't do much if there's a row in Queensland. Most of the rows are across the border, where the pubs are. At least, I believe that's how it is, though the man who told me might have been a liar. Another man said he was a liar, but then he might have been a liar himself. A 3rd person said he was one. I heard there was a fight over it, but the man who told me about the fight might not have been telling the truth. One part of the town swears at Brisbane when things go wrong, and the other part curses Sydney. The country looks as though a great ash heap had been spread out there, and mulga scrub and firewood planted and neglected. The country looks just as bad for 100 miles around Hungerford, and beyond that it gets worse. a blasted barren wilderness that doesn't even howl. If it howled, it'd be a relief. I believe that Burke and Wills found Hungerford, and it's a pity they did. But if I ever stand by the graves of the men who first travelled through that country, when there were neither roads nor stations, nor tanks, nor bores, nor pubs, I'll take my hat off. There were brave men in the land in those days. It is said that the explorers gave the district its name chiefly because of the hunger they found there, which has remained there ever since. I don't know where the ford comes in. There's nothing to ford, except in flood time. Hunger thirst would have been better. The town is supposed to be situated on the banks of a river called the Paroo, but we saw no water there, except for what passed for it in a tank. The goats and sheep and dogs and the rest of the population drink there. It's dangerous to take too much of that water in a raw state. Except in flood time, you couldn't find the bed of the river without the aid of a spirit level and a long straight edge. Now, there's a custom house against the fence on the northern side. A pound of tea often costs 6 shillings on that side, and you can get a common lead pencil for 4p at the rival store across the street in the mother province. Also, a small loaf of sour bread sells for 1 shilling at the humpy aforementioned. Only about 60% of the sugar will melt. We saw one of the storekeepers give a deadbeat swagman 5 shillings worth of rations to take him on into Queensland. The storekeepers often do this and put it down on the lost side of their books. I hope the recording angel listens and puts it down on the right side of their book. We camped on the Queensland side of the fence and after tea had a yarn with an old man who was minding a mixed flock of goats and sheep, and we asked him whether he thought Queensland was better than New South Wales or the other way around. He scratched the back of his head and thought a while, hesitated like a stranger who's going to do you a favour at some personal inconvenience. At last, with the bored air of a man who's gone through the same performance too often before, he stepped deliberately up to the fence and spat over it into New South Wales. After which he got leisurely through and spat back on Queensland. That's what I think of the blanky colonies, he said. He gave us time to become sufficiently impressed, and then he said, and if I was at the Victorian and South Australian border, I'd do the same thing. He let that soak into our minds and added, and the same with West Australia and Tasmania. And then he went away. That last would have been a long spit. And he forgot Maoriland. We heard afterwards that his name was Clancy, and he'd that day been offered a job droving at 25 shillings a week and find your own horse. Also, find your own horse feed and tobacco and soap and other luxuries at station prices. Moreover, if you lost your own horse, you'd have to find another, and if that died or went astray, you'd have to find a third or forfeit your pay and return on foot. The boss drover agreed to provide flour and mutton when such things were procurable. Consequently, Clancy's decidedly unfavourable opinion of the colonies. My mate and I sat down on our swags against the fence to talk things over. One of us was very deaf. Presently a black tracker went past and he looked at us and returned to the pub. And then a trooper came in Queensland uniform and he asked what the trouble was about and where we came from and where we were going and where we'd camped. We said we were discussing private business. And he explained that he thought it was a row and he came over to see. And then he left us. Later on, we saw him sitting with the rest of the population on a bench under the hotel veranda. Next morning, we rolled up our swags and left Hungerford to the northwest.
Wonderful stuff. That first story where the ministry somehow goes from building the road to actually building the road is very sneaky.
And yes, I mentioned earlier, some people have just joined in. Of course, Henry and Banjo had already had their wonderful, only semi-joking, semi-serious battle in the bulletin about the romantic view of the bush versus the pessimist view of the bush.
But as Lawson says in The Bush Undertaker,
yes.
And the sun sank again on the grand Australian bush, the nurse and tutor of eccentric minds, the home of the weird, and of much that is different from things in other lands.
When we first were introduced to Chris Kempster, I had so much in common with Chris, even though we were separated by a lot of years. We were first sort of introduced to the folk scene, but it turned out we'd both lived I was on a farm outside of Portland for a little while as a kid, and he'd been in Portland as a kid. There are lots of things that we could think of in common, including a real love of Henry Lawson. But Chris had done so much work, and around about that same time, we joined up and we ended up playing with Loongawilli Colonial Dance Band down on the south coast of New South Wales. And one of the songs in their repertoire, with Graham Murray singing, was Mike Jackson's setting of Song of the Old Bullock Driver. Mike Jackson had written a beautiful tune. Graham sang it beautifully. We've been singing it ever since. I remember at Chris Kempster's 70th birthday party, Chloe singing this song. I bet she doesn't remember it. We might have been...
Yeah.
You do?
At the house.
Yeah, at the house, yeah. We were drinking with John Dengate that night, so everything's a little hazy, I've got to say. But what a session it was, and we had a great time with the old Wongawilli dance band singing this song. But I guess the real credit I'd like to give here is to Mike Jackson. If you're out there, Mike, g'day. I hope you're faring okay down there south of the border.
Yeah.
Feel not getting you down too much, and managing to still squeeze a tune out, I'm sure.
Stay home and play tunes.
I hope so. We love your tune for this one, mate. Love it. And yes, this is a piece from back in the soft country. Henry had lots of experience with the Bullock teams as a kid, including, his mum was quite seriously dragging them away from the Bullock drivers with their their notorious language.
Taken inside and locked up when the Bullocks came through.
But one of the things that's unusual when Henry starts writing about the Bullock teams is normally his empathy is always with the people. Always with the people. His ability to get inside how someone else is feeling that's his exquisite skill, I think, to my way of thinking. But in this case, it's also the beasts.
Yeah, we've called the whole show The Soul of a Poet. And when we finally get to playing the theme song in Henry Lawson number 3, you'll hear why he really did regard that as his job, stepping into other people's shoes and writing for them, speaking, describing their world for them. Yeah, it's just...
While you tune, I'll just do a little ad.
Good.
For those people who are tuning in for the first time and unfamiliar with what we're doing, we've been sending these concerts out now. This is number 11 of the Saturday streaming, so there's approaching 20 hours of shows up there on YouTube now. Everything goes okay technically, and so far we haven't had, touch wood, nothing's let us down. It'll go up to YouTube afterwards. Sometimes the internet can be a bit dodgy either here or at the connection at your end, so it goes up to YouTube afterwards. They're free concerts, but we do really encourage donations. If you can chip in, as I tend to say, a little bit helps a lot, and a lot helps enormously. And just quickly, I'll also add that the future of music live streamed on Facebook is cloudy at the moment at best. Facebook seems to be changing the way it feels about us and people like us doing this kind of thing.
I'm not sure why.
No. The only thing that I'd say is at the moment, watch this space. You could do us a really big favour by jumping on our YouTube channel.
And, so not the Facebook channel, but the YouTube channel, because if we do have to transfer to YouTube, I think you need 1,000 followers or something. And we're aware of that, so if anyone would like to sign up.
As Joko Kevin said to us, it's not for everyone, mate.
It's not.
But yeah, and if you do want to donate, the website has a very simple button there. I've remembered to bring a few of our CDs in. It's hard to find one of our albums without any Henry Lawson on it, but that's the...
That one has a few more, strangely.
That one is...
Being the Henry Lawson album.
Yeah.
Yeah. but they all have a few.
Here's Mike Jackson setting for this song of the old Bullock driver.
Far back in the days when the blacks used to ramble in long single file in the evergreen tree, the wool teams in season came down from Canamble, journeyed for weeks on their way to the sea, with mates who have gone to the great Never Never, and mates whom I've not seen for many a day. I camped on the banks of the Cosgrove River, yarned at the fire by the old Bullock dray. Were it ever so chilly, when yokes and tarpaulins were covered with frost, and toasted the bacon and boiled the black billy, while high on the campfire the branches were tossed. On flats where the air was suggestive of possums, and homesteads and fences were hinting at change, saw the faint glimmer of apple tree blossoms, and far in the distance the blue of the rain. Here in the rain there was small use in flogging the poor tortured bullocks that tugged at the load, when down to the axles the wagons were bogging. Traffic was making a marsh of the road. Then slowly we crawled by the trees that kept tally of miles that were passed on the long journey down. We saw the wild beauty of Caperty Valley. As slowly we rounded the base of the crown. Terrible pinches where two teams of bullocks were yoked to a load, tugging and slipping and moving by inches. Halfway to the summit they clung to the road. But then when the last of the pinches was bested, you'd surely not say that a glass was a sin. The bullocks lay down neath the gum trees and rested. The bullock he steered for the bar of the inn. Load that I carried was one to the run where my sweetheart was nurse. We courted a while and agreed to get married and couple our futures for better or worse. As my old feet grew too weary to drag on the miles of rough metal they met by the way, my eldest grew up and I gave him the wagon. He's plodding along by the bullocks today.
(1891), and yes, that poem very much in my mind is set around that, well, Caperty Valley is mentioned in the cudgel. Another piece from 1891, but a very different piece, and we mentioned that Chris Kempster's 70th birthday party there in Lawson Street, Lawson in the Blue Mountains. Yes, it's true. This, I remember John singing this one, John Dengate singing this one. We're going to join these together to give the appearance of a medley. In early 1891, Henry came back home. There's no question in my mind that for the rest of Henry's life, home was that valley there at Urundaree, Pipe Clay, between Golgong and Mudgee. Those hills is what he thought of as home. I think he's said as much himself. And in early 1891, again to try and get him some help with his problem with the grog, especially, he went. He had to spend some time there, and Song the Old Bullock Driver come from that time. Then he got an offer to go and work in Queensland on the Boomerang, and was writing about the shearers' strikes in Western Queensland. It's 1891. That year should ring many, many bells. He's writing about the shearers' strikes, writing about the foundation of the first political party based in the world, based on the needs, rights and wishes of the working people. I usually have to remind people that that's the Australian Labor Party. They were different days. And Henry had accusations of sedition in the Queensland Parliament over this piece. Yeah, more of that, please. We'll go straight from Freedom on the Wallaby, which I hope we can hear you all singing on the chorus of this one out there. You can see some of the people who've tuned in, I'm sure. Yep. Your voices will be heard. And then we'll jump 10 years from 1891 to a piece he wrote in 1901, a very short poem that he wrote when he was in London. He'd gone off to London. We'll deal a bit more with that time and onwards with Henry's life in Henry Lawson Part 3 in The Soul of the Pod, but we really wanted to grab this poem because it's a piece written about federation. It's something that Henry had fought with his mates for so long. The more I read about Henry in his own words and what people have said about him, the more convinced I am that his socialism, his strong, strident left-wing politics, hardcore left-wing politics, started in the room and started as with a Republican view. It was clearly it was the Australian way. The old country was the Tories' way. This was a time when that was the way the country was set up, and I remain convinced of that. Hence, so many progressive steps in our politics. Hence, being the second country in the world to give women the vote. It sounds like it was some great gift, doesn't it? It's amazing to even think we could have a time like that. But yes, 1901, the time of federation, something that he'd been fighting for, and there he was, 10,000 miles away in London town. And we'll go straight from that piece into another piece from even later in Henry's life, where we're really starting to see how much of a toll the fight is taking on Henry. Bread while loafers thrive beside 'em, but food to eat and clothes to wear their native land denied 'em. And so they left their native land in spite of their devotion, and so they came, or if they stole, were sent across the ocean. Australia's a big country and freedom's thumping bluey. Freedom's on the Wallaby, oh, don't you hear her cooey? Just begun to boomerang, she'll knock the tyrant silly. She's going to light another fire and boil another billy.
Freedom couldn't stand the glare of royalty's regalia. She left the loafers where they were and came out to Australia. Now across the mighty main, the chains have come to bind her. She little thought to see again the wrongs she left behind her. Australia's a big country and freedom's something bluey. Our freedom's on
on the Wallaby. Don't you hear her cooey? She's just begun to boomerang. She'll knock the tyrant silly. She's going to light another fire and boil another billy. Our parents toiled to make a home, heart-grubbing 'twas in clearing. They wasn't troubled much with lords when they was pioneering. Now that we have made the land a garden full of promise, old greed must crook his dirty hand and come to take it from us. So we must fly a rebel flag as others did before us, and we must sing a rebel song and join in rebel chorus. We'll make the tyrants feel the sting of those that they would throttle. They needn't say the fault is ours if blood should stain the wattle. I met with Jack Cornstalk in London today. He smiled and cooeyed from over the way. The solemn-faced Londoners stared with surprise at his hair and his height as compared with his size. For his trousers were short and his collar was low, and there's no room to cooey in London, I know. But I said to him, Jack, as he gripped my hand fast, I hear that our country's a nation at last. I hear they have launched a new ship of the state with men at the wheel who are steering it straight. I hear 'twas the vote of your bushmates and you. Oh, tell me, Jack Cornstalk, if this can be true. I hear that the bitter black strike times are o'er, that Grabbit and Co. shall crush labour no more, that Australians are first where Australia was last, and the day of the fortune adventurers is past. Now that all things are coming we fought for so long. Oh, tell me, Jack Cornstalk, if I have heard wrong. For a moment he dropped the old grin that he wore. He'd a light in his eyes that was not there before. He reached for my hand, which I gave nothing loath, and replied in 2 words, and those words were my oath. They're standing up grand, Toby Barton and C, and Australia's all right. You can take it from me.
Oh, when you got no chance at all, take it fighting. When you're driven to the wall, take it fighting. There are things that we delight in, for the wrong and other right in. But the fool you cannot frighten, who you cannot bluff nor frighten, he is king of all, take it fighting. Oh, when you're down and out and not tired, take it fighting. When they put you in the gutter, you take it fighting. There are things that we delight in, for the wrong and other right in. But the fool you cannot frighten, who you cannot bluff nor frighten, he is king of all, take it fighting. Chance at all, take it fighting. When you're driven to the wall, you take
we delight in, for the wronging or the righting. But the fool you cannot frighten, who you cannot bluff nor frighten. He is king of all, take it fighting. Yeah, when you're down and out, take it fighting. When they put you in the gutter, you take it fighting. There are things that we delight in, for the wrong or the right, but the fool you cannot frighten, who you cannot bluff nor frighten. He is king of all, take it fighting. Yes, from a little later in Henry's life, a set of words that I find chilling and cutting. Thank you very much for I see some people down south have subscribed and donated, and we do appreciate it very much. Anne Edwards, hi Anne. Anya, I hope I've got the pronunciation right, but nice to meet you as well. That is where we're going to stop with Henry, and we're going to come back now and just think a little bit about Henry on the track again. Before Henry left Burke, I think we've already hinted at this, his politics had a little pragmatic panel beating from time on the track and from working in the shearing shed. Only briefly. It's quite the shed's still there, by the way, at Turondale. If you want to go out and have a look, you can. I've had the pleasure of reciting Henry's work in that shearing shed, the one shearing shed that he actually did work in his life as a dog's body. But after that time at Turondale, where they were shearing late in the season, the disruptions because of the strikes and the year before they'd shorn over around 500,000. That number is someone's going to correct me on that number, but a lot of sheep. 500,000 sheep the year before. The year that Henry was there, it was a bit down a bit, but they'd had strike interruptions, and they were shearing right up to Christmas. They headed off, and they decided to have Christmas in Burke, and then they walked to Hungerford. And on the way back from Hungerford, Henry, probably still with Jim Gordon, the most likely case at this point is that he's still with Jim Gordon, his best mate, had an experience with one of the squatters there that sort of, again, changed his politics a little bit. Actually, it got him into trouble with some of the more hardcore unionists a bit later on.
Yeah, so he'd come across some of the unionists in the sheds who he found a bit hard to get on with. And then he also found a squatter who was very generous. So he was trying to reconcile this with his more general sort of political philosophy. And being a humanist as he is, Henry, he puts himself in other people's shoes and he writes about their perspective. But some of his mates were less than pleased with this next little sketch.
As mentioned already, Henry was an immaculate swagman. His camps were neat. There was one way to roll the swag. There was one way to set up. He was full of energy for the track. He was the last to stop and the first to start. And he was the one who looked after everyone else. When the camp was bigger, that empathy. Jim always said that you'd think you'd had a cold night, but you'd wake up in the morning and it was Henry that had thrown the extra blanket on you. But he was also canny. Okay, and being smart on the track really helped. And I think this is a bit of that going on here. This is Henry's story. Baldy Thompson. Rough, squarish face, curly auburn wig, bushy grey eyebrows and moustache, and grizzly stubble. Baldy Thompson. Eyes that reminded one of Dampier, the actor. He was a squatter of the old order. New chum, swagman, drover, shearer, super, pioneer, cocky, squatter, and finally, bank victim. He'd been through it all and knew all about it. He'd been in Parliament and wanted to go in again. He did actually, a bit later on. But the men mistrusted him as Thompson MP, though they swore by him as old Baldy Thompson the squatter. His hobby was politics, and his politics were badly boxed. When he wasn't cursing the banks and the government, he cursed the country. He cursed the Labour leaders at intervals and seemed to think he could run the unions better than they could. Also, he seemed to think he could run Parliament better than any Premier. he was generally voted a hard case in a kindly sense, Outback. He was always grumbling about the country if a shearer or a rouseabout was good at argument and a bit of a politician himself. He hadn't to slave much at Thompson's shed, for Baldy would argue with him all day and pay for it. I can't put on any more men, he'd say to travellers who are after stragglers. Oh, I can't put on a lot of men to make big cheques when there's no money in the bank to pay them, and I've got all I can do to get tucker for my family. Oh, I saw nothing but burrs and grass seed last season, and it didn't pay carriage. I'm just sending away a flock of sheep now, and I won't make threepence a head for 'em. I had 20,000 in the bank season before last, and now I can't count on one. I'll have to roll up me swag and go on the track myself next. All right, Baldy, they'd say. Get out your bloomin' swag. Come along with us. Old man, we'll stick to you. We'll see you through. I swear I'd show you round first, he'd reply. Go up to the store, get what rations you want. You can camp in the huts tonight and I'll see you in the morning. But most likely, he'd find his way over after tea, sit on his heels in the cool outside the hut and argue with the swagmen about unionism and politics, and he'd argue all night if he met his match. The track by Baldy Thompson's was reckoned as a good tucker track, especially when a dissolution of Parliament was threatened. Then the guileless traveller would casually let Baldy know that he'd got his name on the electoral roll and show some interest in Baldy's political opinions, and oppose them at first, and finally agree with them and see a lot in them. He'd be led around to Baldy's way of thinking, in fact, and ultimately depart, rejoicing with a full nose bag and a quiet grin for his mate. We'll get time for a bit more from Baldy in a second. But I really wanted to get this song in while we're thinking of Henry on the track. This is one I remember from David de Hugard. But if you look further where the actual tune came from for this one, it's all over the place. Best thought of as traditional, adapted by Dave, I think.
Yes.
And so Henry was a bushman. He was good at it. Some people in Henry's day thought Henry was, a gun shearer. He probably never shore sheep in his life. He certainly wasn't a gun shearer. He only did work in one shed. I thought he was a lot of things. These days it's been a much more common thing to say, no, he's more of a city bloke, really. And I don't think that's entirely true, though it is interesting that both Banjo and Henry chose to live in the city. It's, if you read Henry thoroughly, you'll find his deep, deep love of our country, the bush. And this is The Tent Poles Are Rotting, with a little tune from Sally Sloane. A tune probably I can imagine Henry dancing to, if you go back far enough.
The tent poles are rotting and the campfires are dead, and the possums may gamble in trees overhead. I'm humping me bluey far out on the land, and the prints of me bluchers sink deep in the sand. Out on the Wallaby, pumping me dry, and I came by the tracks where the sundowners come, and it's northwest and west, or the range isn't far, to the plains where the cattle and sheep stations are, with the sky for me roof and the grass for me barn, and a calico bag comrade my memory reveals, save the spiritless dingo in tow of me heels. But I think of the honest old light of me home, when the stars hang in clusters like lamps from the dome. And I think of the hearth where the dark shadows fall, when my campfire is built on the widest of all. But I'm following fate, for I know she knows best. I follow, she leads, and it's your west be west. When my tent is all torn and my blankets are down, and the rising flood waters flow fast by the can, when the cold water rises in jets from the floor, I lie in me bunk and I listen to the roar. Tomorrow my footsteps will lag as I tramp beneath the weight of a rain-sodden swag. Of the swagman is mostly uphill, there are joys to be found on the Wallaby still. When the day has gone by with its tramp or its toil, and your campfire, your light, and your billy you can boil, comfort and peace in the warmth of your clay, and the yarn of a maid who is tramping that way. But beware of the town, there is poison for years in the pleasure you find in the depths of long years. The bushman gets bushed in the streets of a town, where he loses his friends when his check is knocked down. He is right till his pockets are empty, and then he can hump his old bluey up country again.
Yes, Henry knew, and yes, so much of tonight is about being out and walking this great country and moving around the country. Of course, is taken on a whole different perspective at the moment, and we've said it every week, but we'll say it again for those, especially for those south of the border in Victoria and Melbourne. We just hope things keep heading in that good direction. A little bit more on Baldy Thompson, then we've got one song to finish up with.
Crazy what the world does to you, isn't it? Here's a whole period where people were forced out of their homes and onto the track and wandering. And we're living through the opposite. It's
remarkable that this just slightly sympathetic version of a description of a squatter, if you call it that. I'm sure Baldy would have laughed. We've been out to Baldy's place there. There's not much there anymore, but we've sung at the grave. But yeah, it got Henry in such troubles with his union mates. But it is a great yarn. Yeah, there are many campfire yarns about old Baldy Thompson. One New Year, the shearers, or shearing stragglers, roused him in the dead of night and told him his shed was on fire, and he came out in his shirt and without his wig. He sacked them all there and then, but of course they all went to work as usual the next morning. There's something sad and pathetic about that old practical joke, as indeed there is with all bush jokes. There seems to be a quiet sort of sadness always running through Outback humour, whether alleged or otherwise. There's the usual yarn about a jackaroo mistaking Thompson for a brother rouser and asking him whether old Baldy was about anywhere, and Baldy said, "Why, are you looking for a job?" "Yeah, well, do you think I stand any show? What sort of a boss is Baldy anyway?" "You tramp from here to Adelaide," said Baldy, "and north to the Gulf country, and couldn't find a worse. He's the meanest squatter in Australia, the damned old crawler. He's the meanest. I grafted like a blackfella for him for over 50 years. Baldy was 60. And now the old skunk won't even pay me the last 2 cheques he owes me. Says the bank's got everything he had. And that's an old cry of his, the damned old sneak. Seems to expect me to go short for him to keep his wife and family and relations in comfort. And by God, I've done it for the last 30 or 40 years. And I might go on the track tomorrow worse off than the meanest old whaler that ever humped Bluey. Don't you have anything to do with that scabby Thompson, or you'll be sorry for it. Better tramp to hell than take a job from him." "Well, I think I'll move on. Would I stand any show for some tucker?" "Him? He wouldn't give a dog a crust, and like as not he'd get you running for trespass if he caught you camping on the run. But come along to the store. I'll give you enough tucker to carry on." He patronised literature and the arts too, though in an awkward, furtive sort of a way. We remember how we once turned up at the station hard up and short of tucker, and how we entertained Baldy with some of his own ideas as ours, having been posted beforehand by our mate. How he told us to go get some rations and camp in the hut and see him in the morning. And we did see him in the morning. Had another yarn with him, agreed, and sympathised with him some more. Were convinced on 1 or 2 questions which we had failed to see at first. Cursed things in chorus with him, and casually mentioned that we expected soon to get some work writing for a political paper. And at last he went inside and brought out a sovereign. "Wrap this in a piece of paper. Put it in your pocket. Don't lose it," he said. But we learnt afterwards that the best way to get along with Baldy and secure his goodwill was to disagree with him on every possible point.
I love it. Supporting the arts. He gave Henry and his mate a sovereign.
We're going to finish with a song. This is Soul of a Poet, part 2 of 3. In part 3, we're going to be still working with Henry's work in the 20th century. I've mentioned a couple of times that we're going to set out to prove that Henry's work was far from behind him as he headed into the 1900s. Yeah, the best of his work was still to come. And he wrote about the First World War, and those who know Henry's life at all will realise and see straight away that we have not sung much about his love life.
Not yet.
But that's part 3. So we hope that you'll all join in and come along for part 3. But we'll leave you at this one.
Yeah, love and war.
Something about if you think of that.
Sorry.
and a laugh or two as well. I hope
along the way.
Thank you to those who've donated as we've gone along, and for those who plan to after the show. That's what we generally do after the show, is come and have a yarn to you all. The donations are through the website. That's the best way to do it. If you'd like to buy an album or donate, the website's there. Normally I put a link in. I'll do that as soon as I'm finished. Strikes me that if we think of Take It Fighting as where we're really leaving Henry, as to pick him up next time, then in some way the whole country is splitting the way this song splits two people. We'll sing the song. It's a song called Since Then. I know Doug Jenner sings this one. But when we first started doing the show with Chris Kempster and all our mates 20 years ago and more, the Henry Lawson show, it's Len Neary that I remember singing this song.
Len Neary singing this song, yeah, in the session bar at Canberra.
Len
and
Neary.
on the streets of Wollongong after a concert, in the dark.
So thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll sing this one with all best thoughts for Len, best memories of Len, because hearing Len sing this song was just about as good as it got for me.
Yeah, you're having a good time.
Thanks for joining in. This is Henry meeting up with an old mate and seeing how things have changed and how they haven't.
Let's see if anyone knows who set the tune.
Yes, we won't tell you who wrote the melody, except to say that you all know him.
Yep.
And him.
Oh, I met Jack Ellis in town today. Jack Ellis, my old mate Jack. 10 years ago from the Castle Ray, we carried our swags together away to the never again Outback, to the never again Outback. He saw me first and he knew it was I. The holiday swell he met. Why have we no faith in each other? Why? He made as though he would pass me by, for he thought that I might forget. He thought that I might forget. But he ought to have known me better than that, by the tracks we tramped far out, the sweltering scrub and the blazing flat, whether he came down through each old felt hat, in the hell-born western drought, in the hell-born western drought. I asked him in for a drink with me, Jack Ellis, my old mate Jack. But his manner no longer was careless and free. He followed, but not with a grin that he wore always in days out back, wore always in days out back. Try to live in the past once more, for the present and past combined. But the years between I could not ignore. I couldn't help notice the clothes he wore, and he couldn't but notice mine. He couldn't but notice mine. Oh, he placed his glass on the polished bar, and he wouldn't fill up again. Then he hurried away through the crowded streets, and the rattle of buses and scrape of feet seemed suddenly loud to me, seemed suddenly loud to me. Oh, I met Jack Ellis in town today, Jack Ellis, my old mate Jack. 10 years ago from the Castle Ray, we carried our swags together away to the never again Outback, to the never again Outback, to the never again Outback, to the never again Outback. Couldn't help but think of Len while singing that one. Did anyone guess who wrote the tune? Did anyone know? Anyone get it? Anyone get it?
Anyone get it? Did anyone say? No one said so far, but I'll let you know then That's Slim Dusty's tune for since then, Jack Ellis. Slim did a terrific job. What a version.
Yeah, it's a beauty.
That's it, I think, for part 2. Part 3 in a couple of weeks. Next week we're doing The Game Is Getting Lively, Wedding Mountains Bushrangers. Then we might have a week of just a bit of a variety night, which is sort of a bit of fun, and we'll get back stuck in and see Henry home. We've really enjoyed being able to do Henry properly. Normally you're stuck with an hour or hour and a half to do 3 hour-and-a-half shows, and still feel like you're not
scratching the surface.
No.
Yeah.
But and for those who've chipped some money into the kitty, thank you very much. And all the best to you all. Take care.
Yep.
See ya.
Stay well.